Hello and welcome to the podcast. Um, this is the Property and Investor podcast. I'm your host, Paul, and today's guest is a very special guest. It's Joe Bryan. Joe, how are you?
I'm very well, Paul. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me on.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. The inspiration for this was that I recently attended a conference and saw you speak, Joe, and the person sitting next to me gave me a pretty hard nudge in the ribs as you walked on stage and said, "Paul, you're really going to love this," and he was right. And I think this is a really interesting conversation to have. So if I set the scene very briefly and then allow you to get straight into it, my understanding is that you were having a conversation with friends, and the kind of core part of what we're about to discuss was that kind of in that conversation, and it's evolved into a much bigger piece called what's the problem. I suppose pausing for breath right there. We are unusually in this podcast going to have some slides, some visual stuff. So if you're listening to this podcast, it would be great if you could pause, come over to YouTube, um, Paul Lanfear, Property and Investor podcast, Joe Bryan, what's the problem? Come over to YouTube, and then you can see the slides. Click the subscribe button, and you can understand a bit more of what Joe is telling us. So Joe, um, tell us about the problem.
Well, yeah, I mean, you're right, Paul. I never intended to make a video. Um, it sort of spiraled out of something I created for some friends to
Hmm.
explain the way that I see the world and why I am so passionate about the thing I'm so passionate about, which is not immediately obvious to anybody else, but outside of the people who have already had the penny drop. But when I presented this to them, they didn't know why. All they knew was the title,
Hmm.
what's the problem? And then I took them through this presentation, and by the end of it, they understand what the problem is
Hmm.
and also what the solution is.
Hmm.
Because with anything, if you just present a solution, people don't, unless you understand the problem, people don't recognize the value in the solution.
Hmm.
And it's one of the most misunderstood um, technologies that we have. It was one of the most misunderstood things in the world, full stop.
Hmm.
In large part due to the deliberate misinformation provided around it by the government and the media.
Hmm.
And it's a mix of deliberate misinformation and also just misunderstanding themselves.
Hmm.
Um, but I think this presentation helps anybody from any background understand why we need Bitcoin.
Hmm.
Um, and so, when I presented it to them, they didn't know we were going to end up talking about Bitcoin right at the end. But this is a presentation about Bitcoin that doesn't talk about Bitcoin, which is also very helpful because people have misconceptions,
Hmm.
whether they are conscious of them or not,
Hmm.
and biases, whether they're conscious of them or not.
Hmm.
But once you see the problem, you can't unsee it again, and then the solution becomes obvious.
Hmm.
And so this is about what's the problem,
Hmm.
and the problem that impacts everybody. We're all on the same team for this. There's no left versus right. You know, this is everybody versus the central bank.
Definitely. And I think it's worth just like re-emphasizing that. Like we live in such a polarized world. You know that there are tribes and there are teams, and it feels right now like we're a million, but all the different sides are such a long way away from each other. But if you, what I notice, if you talk to people, they're concerned about the same things. It's the same kind of symptoms of the patient that everybody's worried about, but there's obviously just very different views as to how to get there. So, you know, how would you describe the current symptoms that um, we're seeing?
Um, well, on the screen, hopefully now, Paul, you can see a
Too many.
a list of problems.
Yeah.
And say, well, what is the problem? Well, there's too many of them. I could have written twice as many things down on the screen easily.
Hmm.
And everybody recognizes that most things in the world are not going in the right direction. Things are deteriorating, things are corroding in all aspects of society. But it's very hard to view most of these things as anything other than independent problems.
Hmm.
But they're not independent at all. They're all downstream of a single issue.
Hmm.
And the single issue is the quality of the money that we use.
Hmm.
Now, connecting one with the other is such a leap. It's trying to reverse engineer a complex system to identify a cause, a singular cause, is extremely hard.
Hmm.
Um, and so this presentation was hopefully running it the other way around,
Hmm.
was to take, instead of trying to explain the world we see today, to go back to the start in the form of a story of a far off world where you have people traveling on a ship, lots of smart people, and they traveling across an ocean, and then they run ashore on a deserted island that has all the resources they can need to restart society, but they're starting again from zero. But then they have, despite being in rags, have the ability to create whatever monetary system they want. And so by starting in that point, we can then see how things evolve. And ultimately, we end up back where we are today, but through a simple choice that was made. And so we end up with an island where we have two sides of an island, where one side decides to use perfect money, which has a series of characteristics, and one side under Fiatello that decides to use perfect money, but with the option to change it. And it's the option to change the money. It's the existence of a big red button that somebody can press at any point in time to change the core characteristics of our money, which leads to the issues that we have today. And so maybe just to close the loop on those characteristics of perfect money, like it has to be scarce, and the perfect money would be fixed in supply forever. So it's instantly and costlessly verifiable by anybody at any point in time. So you can be sure no one's producing anymore.
Hmm.
And it can be scarce, absolutely scarce. It doesn't have to all be in circulation at a certain point in time. More can come into circulation over time, as long as work is done and everyone agrees on the work done required to bring money into existence, but it still has a hard cap. And there's benefits for doing that. It needs to be portable, so you need to be able to effortlessly store and move it with negligible costs. A lot of these will seem obvious, but many people have not really thought about what the characteristics of a perfect money would be.
Hmm.
It needs to be divisible, and perfect money would be infinitely divisible, so you can pay for very small items. Durable, so it exists forever without deterioration. Fungible, and this is the one that most people, it seems very obvious, so people probably wouldn't write it down in a list, but every piece of it needs to be the same as every other piece. Like $1 needs to be interchangeable with another dollar. There should be no characteristic differences or limitations on one versus the other.
Hmm.
Everyone needs to be able to accept it anywhere and both send and receive. And it should be censorship resistant. Nobody should be able to stop you sending or receiving or take it from you. You would hold that perfect money yourself. You wouldn't require somebody else to look after that money on your behalf. The intrinsic quality of the money would be self-sovereign. I don't need to put it in a bank because I can carry it myself and it's effortless to do so.
Hmm.
And so those are the characteristics of the perfect money. And then Satoshi says, well, that's great. We all agree on those characteristics. Let's just use that. And then Fiatello says, well, what if there's an emergency? What if something we need to change in the future? The people that we put in charge of our society, they may feel like they need to change something at some point. But of course they won't. So we should have a big red button just in case. No one will ever press it, but we'll have a big red button. And then Satoshi and Fiatello cannot agree on this. So they end up just building a massive wall down the middle of the island. And on one side, they use Satoshis, so it's perfect money forever. And the other side is perfect money until it's not. Until somebody gives in to the temptation of pressing the big red button for an emergency of some sort. And this is where um, the issues start to come in. It's like when you have a government
Mm-hmm.
and however well run any government is, it doesn't matter whether it's left or right, because they're all the same. They're all the
Mm-hmm.
same in every country. They're all the same.
Mm-hmm.
They all just abuse the money because it's politically beneficial for them as individuals to abuse the money because they're only around for 4 years and they don't want to take the pain. They don't want to put the pain on the population, so they kick the can down the road. This is just human nature, and we see it all the time. It's like, we'll mess it up for 4 years, we'll lose the election, and we'll blame it all on the next team that come in. We see this all the time, right? But it doesn't matter if it's left or right. But however well run any government is, you will inevitably hit a deficit at some point in time through natural disaster or something like this. Satoshi, he has perfect money, so he cannot create any more.
Mm-hmm.
So he is, in order to get re-elected, the population have to vote for him. But in order to balance the budget, he has to either raise the taxes or cut the spending.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, the government cannot function. And so he can't hide the changes from the population. But Fiatello, he's worried about getting re-elected. Instead of passing on the increased taxes or the reduced spending, he just says, well, I've got this big red button in the corner. I could just press the big red button and print a bit of extra money for the government and no one would ever know. And that's when we start to see a divergence between the two sides of the island. And I'm missing out big chunks of the story here, Paul. So we haven't talked about what happens in a free market with perfect money. We haven't talked about the quality of life improvements that you see in those situations because the productivity accrues to the money.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't need to lend the money, you don't need to risk the money to have the money become a greater store of value in the future than it is today, because it buys more tomorrow than it does today, which is the opposite of the world that we live in today.
Mm-hmm.
The money is melting as opposed to becoming stronger in its purchasing power. Because we just all assume inflation is this real thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's like natural background phenomenon that no one knows where it comes from, and it's entirely man-made and it's deliberate, absolutely deliberate. But it's obfuscated from the population, because if the population knew where the inflation came from, there would be uproar.
Mm-hmm.
There would absolutely be uproar. And so I think this is the key. This is probably the key slide in the presentation, where it helps people understand the downstream impacts of money printing. And you probably got people listening be like, well, I understand the downstream impacts of money printing. I learned about the Weimar Republic at school, and after the First World War in Germany, they printed loads of money and debased the currency, and then they had hyperinflation, and then the whole economy fell apart. So yeah, we do get told about this, and we have visual pictures in our minds of wheelbarrows full of cash and children playing with like stacks of banknotes as like toys, and like paper money sitting in bushes, and people don't even pick it up because it's not worth picking it up because it's worthless.
Mm-hmm.
But all the money printing then was physical, didn't have computers.
Mm-hmm.
You had to actually go and print the money. Whereas now it's just a zero in a database. You can
Mm-hmm.
print an infinite amount of money with the press of a single button on a keyboard.
And the sort of Weimar Republic hyperinflation seems so abstract. It seems so remote to what we have now. And I know we'll touch on this later, but you don't need, or we clearly, evidently don't need hyperinflation to suffer the challenges which you're going to expand upon in a moment. Like a mere compounded 7% will cause all the destruction in the world.
Yeah.
Um, this I'm keen for us to progress through this slide because it is really fascinating the way that you tie it together, and then I'll ask more questions then. But one of my rules of the podcast is like never be afraid to ask the stupid question. So in the circles that I move in, the conversations I have, it's reasonably common for people to talk about the printing of money. And I think on a certain level, people understand it. But if we can just kind of double click through that, because as you say, we're not talking about physical coins and notes. And if we'd had a bit longer, we might have talked a little bit about the history of money, starting with shells, and then the Europeans kind of being able to replicate glass beads and their devaluation, and then moving on to gold and silver coins, the clipping of coins, the debasing
Yeah.
of the coins. There's a whole conversation around that, but we don't live in that world. We now live in this kind of digital world. So just in terms of like when you're using the expression printing money, just unpack that for us. Like, how does that happen?
Well, it happens in a variety of ways, but you have the ability of the government and also the banks to bring money into existence that didn't exist before.
Mhm. So let's take that in two stages. So stage one, let's talk about how the government approaches it, and then maybe stage two, let's talk about fractional reserve banking, and let's take them in that order, if you don't mind.
Yeah, well, so the government has every independent currency around the world now has a central bank,
Hmm.
and the central bank is mandated with at least one, but usually two key objectives. And the first is to um, is the stability is the stability of the money, and they do that by targeting a 2% inflation rate, and 2% is pulled out of yeah insert insert part of the body. Um, and they've all agreed. They all point at each other and say, "Well, we've chosen 2% because everyone else chose 2%," and it's
Hmm.
it's 2% theft,
Hmm.
2% theft of the savings of everybody because
Hmm.
they generate the inflation.
Hmm.
But the government issues debt to fund itself. So you have UK government bonds, but you also have the central bank that acts as buyer of last resort because it can create money to
Hmm.
buy the bonds if it needs to. And the UK government will sell its bonds to institutions, the public, pension funds, etc., etc. But it has this independent arm, which is the central bank, independent because it's appointed by the government, right? Which can always just print more money to buy the bonds if needed. And so it's all just fabricated.
Hmm.
It's all fabricated. And so the central bank can expand um, the balance sheet of the nation at whim, and so bring more money into existence. And so they're not limited by any real world factor whatsoever. It's just the amount they choose to bring into existence. And then you have the creation of, you know, quantitative easing and these sorts of technical descriptions for what really just amounts to sweeping bad debts onto the balance sheet of the central bank and covering them with money printing.
Hmm.
And if you think about your wealth is, and you store all that wealth in pounds. The proportion of everything that you own is just your pounds divided by all the pounds in existence. If someone else can just print more pounds whenever they want, but you're working for your share, then you're on the losing side of that. You work hard and expend your energy to get paid in something someone else can print for free.
Hmm.
And so, there is different mechanisms for printing money at the central bank slash government level.
Hmm.
But you just Google any chart for like central bank balance sheets. It's an exponential chart. It's like the Weimar Republic, just in slow motion.
Hmm.
It's the same chart. It's just over 40 years, not 4 years. It's the only difference. The
Hmm.
outcome, the outcome is going to be the same. The purchasing
Hmm.
power of the money goes to zero. That's it. You can't keep money in the bank. You know you can't keep money in the bank. It's why you invest in property.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting. I think most people inherently know that something is broken
Yeah.
because, and that you can see it in their behaviors, the way they spend money and the way they invest money. Uh, I mean, I think there's lots of people who have historically bought property who didn't know really why they were buying property.
Yeah.
They just, the number goes up over a longer period of time. I think we do need to be also a little bit careful, just on a humanitarian point of view. When you speak to baby boomers, and I say this without any criticism, and they tell you that their house is 40x in the time they've
Yeah.
owned it, and you do the mental maths wherever you live, and let's say the average house price is £250,000, and you think, well, that if that happens again, that's going to be £10 million for an average house. And what does that mean for our kids and our grandkids? Which might sound like an unusual thing for somebody in the property space to say, but we're all human beings as well, aren't we? Um, Touch on fractional reserve banking, and then we'll continue with this next piece.
Yeah, well, fractional reserve. We don't have fractional reserve banking in the UK anymore, but to all intents and purposes, the effect of it is exactly the same. It's just called something else.
Hmm.
And and this is banks have a license from the government to bring money into existence. So within the banking sector, banks have a certain amount of capital, and you have reserve requirement ratios, which means that banks can carry exposure through loans and things like that to a certain multiple of the capital they have. Now, in the US, the capital reserve ratio is zero, so they can offer as many loans as they want with no capital in the background, which just tells you like what a shambles the banking system has become. And over time, these reserve requirements get reduced and reduced and reduced because of the fragility of the banking sector. But even if it was say 10%, you would you can still take 10 times leverage on your equity base of the bank. So you have, £1,000 of capital from investors. You can now bring £10,000 worth of previously non-existing money into existence by lending it to you,
Hmm.
right? To buy a house or to buy whatever. It
Hmm.
doesn't have to be an investment. It could be a commercial loan. It could be, to go and buy a car,
Hmm.
right? Which depreciates. Now, the banks do very well on that because they get to charge interest on something that never existed. They get to charge you interest. They never had to have the money in the first place to lend it. They're bringing money, printing money, bringing it into existence.
Hmm.
Now, it all works out great if you pay the money back. And if it's a car loan, the car's depreciating. So the asset, they lend you 10,000. After a year, the car's now worth 5,000. If you stop paying and they take the car back, it covers half the loan.
Hmm.
They've lost 50%, but they only had 10% equity in the bank. And so, for some assets like housing, you're probably not going to lose 50% in a year. And, there's the benefit over time is it's been monetized.
Hmm.
And as the government prints more money, the house prices gradually go up slightly slower than the rate of money printing. So it's like it's approximate way of storing wealth,
Hmm.
as opposed to putting it in the bank, but you're still losing overall because of the cost of doing it, taxes, etc., etc. It's like slowly siphoning your wealth away, just not as fast as if it was in the bank.
Mhm.
And so those loans are, slightly higher quality, but it doesn't take very much. And 10% is not where the reserve requirements are for the vast majority of the world, including the UK. So the amount of leverage in the system is very high.
Mhm.
And when the amount of leverage in the system is very high, and you have a banking sector which is very increasingly concentrated over time,
Mhm.
you end up with institutions that are too big to fail. So if there's any downturn in the assets, they get wiped out. It doesn't take much to lose 2%, loss rate on your loan book. If you've got 2%, reserve ratio requirements, you're like 50 times leveraged. You get entirely wiped out if 2% of your loans go bad. That's a horrible place to be. And this is the banking sector. So
Mhm.
what happens when there's any sort of economic shock is the banks suddenly call up the central bank and the government and say, guys, if asset prices fall, we're dead. And if we're dead, all of those deposits that the public have made into our institutions are gone. Because when you put your money, your pounds in the bank, you're lending that to the bank. They'll give you an account and you'll say, like, I've got £1,000 in an account.
Mhm.
It's not, you've lent them £1,000. They go bust, that's gone. The government then sits behind and says, oh, well, we'll guarantee deposits up to,
Mhm.
whatever, whatever. But that's the socialization of the risk that the private entity, the bank, is taking.
Mhm.
And if it works out, the bank gets to keep the benefit.
Mhm.
If it goes wrong, the bank calls the government and says, you guys need to bail us out, or else the depositors lose the money. And the politicians can't have banks failing and depositors losing money because it costs them votes.
Mhm.
It's happened on their watch. So what do? They bail the banks out.
Mhm.
They bail the banks out. They sweep the central bank. They create a bad bank.
Mhm.
They sweep all the bad loans from the banks into the national bad bank, underwritten by the central bank.
Mhm.
Right? Those loans inevitably lose value over time, and tens of billions, hundreds of billions, and the central bank just prints money to paper over the cracks. The banks
Mhm.
get the fresh balance sheet again.
Mhm.
They now can start making loans again, start making money again, until 10 years later, the same thing happens. You have a 10-year boom, and then the house prices drop or the stock market drops, 10%, and everyone's panicking. They start getting bailouts again. This is the same cycle over and over. But what happens is the only outcome is the banks just get more and more leveraged.
Mhm.
Oh, sorry, there's several outcomes. The banks get more and more leveraged because they realize there's no downside. We
Mhm.
get to keep the upside, and if something goes wrong, we get bailed out. It's like, why would you? You're encouraged to take risk, right?
Mhm.
And on the other side, every time it goes wrong, the central bank just prints more money.
Mhm.
And so
Which
the
takes
monetary base just expands forever. And you play that forward, you get a banking system that has ever greater levels of leverage, which
Mhm.
is ever more centralized because the weaker players in the banking system get bought by the bigger players every time there's a crisis.
Mhm.
Because the smaller players fail first, they get bought with sweetheart deals and government guarantees against losses by the bigger players. So you end up with a smaller and smaller number of participants with greater and greater leverage, more and more chance of getting bailed out, which leads to more and more money printing forever.
Mhm. Which takes us nicely
Yeah.
onto currency debasement.
Yeah.
So, the, take us through this. Like, take us through all of these consequences of currency debasement, because when I saw this in real time at the conference, the conference was in absolute stunned silence. You could have heard a penny drop. So, talk us through this interconnectedness of the consequences of currency
Yeah.
debasement.
Okay. So when Fiatello, and we talk about this in an abstract sense, but this just maps onto the real world. So
Mhm.
we abstract all the complexity around money printing, Paul, into just there being a giant big red button
Yeah.
the government can press or Fiatello can press whenever he wants to print a little bit of extra money for the government. But that's just expanding the amount of money in existence for free, whereas everyone else has to work for it.
Mhm.
And so that debases the currency, and that has three core impacts. The first is that it distorts price signals in the free market. The second is that it causes business input costs to increase for everybody. And the third, it leads to asset inflation, which is probably the most relevant of the points for you and your listeners. Now, that first one, the distortion of the price signals, in the story, prior to Fiatello pressing the button for the very first time, it was an entirely free market. Now, we left a free market God knows how many years ago. Like we are already in this massively distorted state. We do not live in free market capitalism whatsoever.
So I had a question on that, Joe,
Yeah.
which is like when did I suppose to take a step back and then answer that question. You think about the role of technology, technology and innovation, which when people watch your video on YouTube, which we're going to send them to, they'll see what the impact of free markets and technology and innovation are. And a really good friend of mine who like politically is like far apart to the left asked me a really good question, which I struggle to answer, which is, Paul, if all this technology and innovation is such a good thing, why are people working longer and life is harder when technology and innovation were meant to be the solution? Now, I'm going to allow you to like engage with this because
It's a big red button.
but
It's because
yeah,
the government has a big red button.
but
The
you
the
think
the
about it,
world.
in our phones, like we could send like this is the same technology that would take a spaceship to the moon
Yeah.
back in the day, but yet we all have it in our pockets. But yet everybody is working harder, and everybody's feeling like life is getting more and more difficult. Um, it's it's interesting, but I kind of interrupted you. I think go back to.
Uh, well. This fits nicely here. When you do not have the ability to print money, the natural outcome of the free market and human action is that prices fall and quality goes up
Mhm,
through a combination of human innovation, human action, and competition.
mhm,
Prices fall and quality goes up because people's purchasing is driven from a combination of highest quality at lowest price. That's it.
mhm,
If you do not deliver those on some measure or between those two, you don't make sales and you go out of business. That's the free market.
mhm,
Okay. And technological innovation drives prices lower. It makes processes more efficient. It increases levels of specialization, increases levels of competition, reduces barriers. Yeah.
mhm.
It's very obvious that prices should fall and quality goes up when you have humans left alone. This is just what happens in the free market. But that's absolutely not what we see today. And it's not what we see today because the money's corrupted.
So like I don't expect a simple answer to this,
Yeah.
and we can move on straight from it. I suppose the burning question I have inside is, well, when did the free markets die? I mean, I noticed in my own world that around 2018, I was really getting a visceral sense that something was really not right. And then I think most people, if you stop them in the street, would say post COVID, the world has changed, and if you were to ask them, well, tell me what the symptoms are, they would say, well, why is the town centre a zombie town? Why are the shops empty? Like, why do we have so many people quite evidently struggling with addiction and mental health,
Yeah.
homelessness? And I know you were going to expand upon that in a moment. So, but I suppose if there was a quick answer, Joe, like when did the free markets die?
A long time ago. And you had the best a long time before COVID. So most people would point you to 1971, but that's when the US came off the gold standard and allowed the US to print as many dollars as it wanted and the rest of the world to print as many fiatellos in whatever currency that they wanted as 1971. And if you look at the purchasing power of money for hundreds of years before that, there's basically zero inflation.
Mhm.
net. I mean, occasionally you have wars, there's money printing, and then there's a rebalancing because everything is linked back to a hard asset like gold. You have
Hmm.
gold standard, and every time somebody creates paper money, things fall apart. You get inflation temporarily, it collapses, they move back to a gold standard or a hard money standard.
Okay.
Yeah. And in the future, it's going to be Bitcoin as the hardest money in the world.
And
But
I'm gonna allow you to get back to this slide to continue with the distorted money and then take it to the other end because it does bring this all together very nicely.
but I would just add the 100 years in the US in the 1800s, you effectively had a free market, an expanding economy out with minimal government intervention and
Mhm.
free markets, and prices fell for 100 years,
Mhm.
average of 1 to 2% a year for 100 years.
Mhm.
And the greatest economic boom in history, greatest quality of life increase for a nation in history. It's because you let people benefit from the free market.
Mhm.
Money became more valuable over time. People were able to store their economic energy for the future. They're not trying to save in a melting ice cube that someone else can print for free.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, when you have that free market, the only reason prices would change is that if there's a change in demand or supply.
Mhm.
And so that pricing mechanism, pricing changing is in any given good or sector is a price signal to all the entrepreneurs and the capital allocators in the market. If the demand goes up or supply is constricted, prices start going up in a certain area, and it's a signal to all the entrepreneurs, right? There's more profit to be competed for over here. You should bring some extra supply to this market to satisfy the demand. This is just the free market.
Mhm.
Whereas when the government prints money, goes into the pocket of the government then spend it with people connected to the government to bring it into the economy. This is
Mhm.
how it reaches the economy. But then that looks like demand in those bits of the economy start sending the prices higher.
Mhm.
It's not demand, it's just extra money. But to everyone else in the economy, it looks like demand. And so it's the demand, it's the price signal to all the entrepreneurs, capital allocators, right? There's extra profit to be fought for over here. And
Mhm.
it starts to suck in investment, human capital, real capital, away from the other parts of the economy.
Mhm.
So they're leaving parts of the economy that where they were contributing competitive competitiveness
Mhm.
to get sucked to a point in the economy where it wasn't real. The demand is not real. So you're reducing the quality of the overall economy,
Mhm.
making them taking them from something where they're providing services to increase competition, reduce prices, increase quality for everyone else, and putting them closer to the government,
Mhm.
where it's entirely driven from the money printing, not extra demand. And so you're weakening the economy overall.
Mhm.
So that leads to just a misallocation of capital. And the
Mhm.
more you print, the more you compound that until ultimately you end up eroding the productivity gains that accrue through technological innovation across the rest of the economy because you pulled away all the entrepreneurs close to the government. Right? So you destroy the productivity gains. The second is that business input costs increase. So when the government spends with these people connected to the government, those prices go up. They then spend with other businesses and they pay their employees. And eventually this money gradually works its way from business A to business B to business C through the economy. Now, the natural impact of that is that input costs start to go up, human costs, raw material inputs for other companies. And so everybody starts to feel like their profit margins are being squeezed
Mhm.
because their input costs are going up, and now every business is faced with a choice. Like I need to protect my profit margin to justify even running this business. Otherwise, I don't have to run the business. I close the business, I go work for someone else. I don't need to take the risk if the reward is insufficient. So given my input costs have gone up, I now need to pass on some form of um, margin increase back to the customer. So I have three options. I can pass on the price directly. I can just increase the price of my product. I can shrink my product, or I can try and reduce costs in some way. And this is just where consumer inflation comes from. It's the only source of consumer inflation, is businesses having to respond to the fact the government has printed money. Government prints money, input costs go up. Businesses need to defend their profit margins, so they need to pass on those changes to the government. And so the first one, I'll go right to left here, like consumer price increases. Easiest way is just to say, well, my input costs have gone up. I'll keep the product the same size. Like imagine a real product. Keep the product the same size, same quality. I'll just increase the price. So it's now 10% more expensive. That hurts the consumer because now they're paying more for the same thing they bought yesterday. The alternative is to say, well, I'll just keep this quality the same, the price the same. I'll just shrink the product.
Mhm.
So now the consumer gets 90 grams, not 100 grams, and we see this in the shops. Right? This is the shrinkflation. It still hurts the consumer
Mhm.
because they needed 100 grams. They just have to buy more or buy it more frequently. So you still get hit by the inflation. It's just the sticker price hasn't changed. Or the more the sort of more hidden one is to reduce the businesses to try and reduce their input costs again. So keep the price the same, the size the same, but compromise on something else. And it's, two things. It's firing people.
Mhm.
So now there's no customer service available. But you could never get hold of anybody to to if you've got any problems because they fired all the staff, right, to try and maintain their profit margin. Um, and if you fire people, you create a problem for the government. The government's now like, okay, well, how do we support all these people who are now unemployed? But the other one, the more insidious one is you reduce the input quality. So now I'll create the same product, same size, same price, but it's just worse. So if it's a mechanical product, it just has worse components. It breaks sooner.
Mhm.
So it breaks sooner, you have to replace it sooner. It's still inflation. It's the frequency at which you buy it increases. Or if it's the food, the quality ingredients that used to go into the food are replaced with lower quality ingredients, a more industrialized pharmaceutical driven sludge.
Mhm.
And this leads to a health crisis because the food is now declining in quality because they've pressed the big red button. And so people, Fiatello starts to see an obesity crisis and knock-on health issues, which puts more pressure on his government. It's like, oh, I've now got to try and make all these people deal with the consequences of this increasingly unhealthy outcomes driven from the food. And so if you think about what's really happening here is they're pressing the big red button, they're printing money, and that's translating into inflation for the population. But there's inflation you see, which prices going up, which squeezes you. There's inflation that you sort of see. The prices don't go up, but the products shrink, which impacts your affordability. And there's the inflation that you sort of don't see at all, or you're not cognizant of, or you don't join the dots on, and that's the quality. And so you're paying for that inflation through your health, or you're paying for that inflation just by having to buy it more frequently because it's crap, because
Mhm.
the product is worse quality. Yeah. And so there's visible, there's semi-visible, and there's hidden
Mhm.
inflation. And then the third main area of inflation is asset inflation. So, as Fiatello is pressing the big red button, he's printing more Fiatellos, but he's bringing those into existence overnight with no effort. But the economy has a set of products and services that require effort to bring into existence. Like factories, houses, all of these sorts of things. Shares, shares that represent claims on those things. If he doubles the amount of Fiatellos that are washing around the system, the fair price for all of those things is double because there's twice as much money for the same amount of things.
Mhm.
Apart from he doesn't print 100% overnight, he prints 5% a year or 10% a year. So you just start to see assets going up in price gradually. And they go up in price because he's printing money. Some people know he's printing money. And if you know someone's printing money, you know the amount of money in the system's going up every year, you wouldn't sell your house for the same you sold it for last year. If you normalize by the amount of money, house prices haven't changed. Stock market hasn't moved. It's because you just printed more money. And so if you kept that money in the bank, you would be losing over time because your share of the pie is just constantly declining because they're bringing new money into existence. Whereas if you own a house, you have you own an asset that's hard to produce, that has, a limited supply to some degree. It still loses money over time when when you factor in the level of money printing.
Mhm.
But it looks like you're making money. You feel better because you see the value of it when measured in the thing they're printing going up.
Mhm.
But your share of the overall pie is going down. And this is why people feel like they're getting wealthier, but life never gets any easier. It's because on paper, they're wealthier, but the share of the pie is going down.
Mhm.
Some people, it's going down a lot faster if they don't own the assets.
Mhm.
And so Fiatello, he thinks by pressing the big red button, like he's some economic genius because now all the asset prices go up, and he thinks this is a good thing. But it's a good thing only for some people. And even then, it's only a good thing because it makes them lose less than the people who don't own them. But the people who don't own them tend to be the ones suffering most under reduced affordability, because they're on fixed wages or living paycheck to paycheck. They don't own assets. And when you're getting squeezed on your cost of living because of the money printer, and then you're seeing the things you would like to buy in the future, like a house, like a family house, accelerate away from you in terms of cost because of the money printer as well, then you're getting squeezed from both sides.
Mhm.
And so he ends up seeing an increased level of wealth inequality across the economy. It's between the have assets and they don't have assets. And it sees increased level of homelessness because now houses are more expensive. So the rent is more expensive. Fewer people can afford them. So you have increased homelessness and more pressure on the government. And go back to the banks because the assets are going up in price. When people want to buy them, they have to take out more debt. So you get more leverage in the banking system. The banks push the leverage, they push speculation because they get to make fees from lending and the origination of it. And so you get more and more leverage entering the economy for the individuals, the companies, and the states themselves. And then when you have more leverage in the economy, more debt for all the individuals, all the asset prices are more expensive, and your reduced affordability for the population, like a family can't buy a house anymore
Mhm.
on one salary. You need both parents working to be able to afford the house and afford to live. And if you need both parents working, you see the breakdown of the nuclear family because they're not spending time together. There's more stresses at home. It's more and more about the money and less about the family. And you see a declining birth rate. People can't afford to have kids. You can't afford not to be working because you lose the house, you lose the roof over your head, or you won't be able to put food on the table. So how are you meant to afford a child there?
Mhm.
If you have children, you then got to pay for childcare or take time off work. It just doesn't work. The economic calculation does not work.
Mhm.
And so he starts to see a reduction in the birth rates. People start having kids later and later and later because they can't get on the housing ladder. They can't get to a point where they feel economically stable to be able to build savings to enable them to have children.
Mhm.
It just doesn't happen because he's pressing the big red button.
Mhm.
And then he starts to see the impact on his pension system. The pension system is insolvent. and he's made promises to all these people as they get older. Like, you pay in every year, and we'll pay out the people who came before you. Like, you don't get it doesn't get saved. It's just out of one pocket into someone else's pocket. And then, but now you have fewer people coming through. Your population is aging overall, and you don't have enough people paying into the system to pay out the pensioners. So now you have to push the retirement age back to try and make it work, or you have to reduce the level of benefits they get in retirement, or the combination of the two, which is what we see. Right?
And when people go to have a look at the video, you then very nicely link to the impact it has on different demographics effectively. So,
Yeah,
you know, the low paid, the middle class, and the wealthy effectively.
yeah,
And it's like I think it's like understood that those on fixed incomes are always going to struggle in an inflationary environment. And also it's hollowing out this middle class as well. It's very common to see couples who are both on really chunky salaries.
yeah,
Gone are the days, when there was flexibility. It's like everybody's working twice as hard, but yet not necessarily progressing as well, which is leading to that, as you say, the declining different choices around having children.
yeah,
Um, a falling birth rate means that we have to import cheap labor, and that's causing consequences. And we're seeing like a whole conversation around that now. And it's interesting, like the when you talk about misallocation of resources. I mean, we could just click onto that, and we could spend hours on that. But I think by any view, when we see what the government spends money on, I think people do naturally scratch their head and wonder what's happening. And I see it. You see it in various industries as well, including obviously the property industry. That um, entrepreneurs' behavior has dramatically changed in the last decade towards property. Um, which is for example, property strategies being developed to optimize for, and I'm being kind of like polite and neutral. There's other words we can maybe use, but they're optimizing for government funding
yeah.
as as,
But
as,
this is the
as opposed.
distortion of the free market. The
Yeah.
distortion of the free market comes through two things: money printing
Hmm.
and government intervention.
Hmm.
The government needs to get out of the free market.
Hmm.
Every intervention the government makes distorts the free market and causes more problems that they then feel that they need to intervene to solve.
Hmm.
Right? The free market can solve all of these things. Just get out the way.
Hmm.
And so governments have the ability to print for free what other people work for, there's no accountability.
Hmm.
They can distort the free market as much as they like because they can just print the money. They can never go bust. They never go bust. They don't have to balance the books. This is why we're in a perpetual deficit since 1971. So you never have to balance the books. You just print more money.
And I would really urge people to go back to that former slide and look at that interconnectedness of the problems, because I think most people can agree there is a problem, and I think most humans agree that there is a feeling that goes with that problem, that something is broken.
Yeah.
We don't know what exactly it is, but we can agree between us as a tribe that something is wrong, um, and there is all of these interconnected issues. I'm conscious of time, but to
Yeah, we
bring
spent a long time talking about those things, but I hope people found them helpful. I encourage them to watch the video because we've skipped around a few things, but hopefully you'll get a sense. But there is the overarching story here is very helpful because you build it up piece by piece,
Mhm,
and so the ultimate conclusion here when you go down this is that Fiatello should never have had the big red button.
mhm,
And Fiatello's side of the island just ends up looking like today.
mhm,
But actually, today is just so much worse. And the last third of the video is explaining why that's the case. Right? It's putting today's world in the context of Fiatello's story. And it just becomes just blindingly obvious that the solution is the separation of money and state. The
And
government,
what's interesting about you and why I urge people to go and seek out the video is, even though you're dealing with a complicated and difficult subject, which is uncomfortable for us all because none of us like the consequences that we're seeing. You come to it with some optimism as well.
Yeah.
Like, you're not, in the short time that we've had together, it is apparent that you are positive. You have hope for the future. Um, I think before we get to that, I think the final point I just really want to underline yet again is that this isn't a left and right issue.
Yeah.
You quote the fantastic analyst Lynn Alden in the video, who has this ongoing meme about nothing stops this train, and recently spoke at another conference, and it was fascinating. She just absolutely nails the point. She said, this can't be left and right because we've just seen it, and the context is obviously Doge in the States, the left up in uproar about Doge and its potential impact on government spending, but yet the Trump administration not implementing really any significant changes. And she kind of makes a joke at this conference, which is well worth watching. She just says, "Look, you can see it's not a left and right thing because they're all nothing stops this trade," which you reference in the video as well.
Yeah, it's exactly right. If you can look at a chart of the monetary base over the last 100 years, you can't tell who's in power. It's all the same. Whether left or right, they print the money.
Now, I'm going to put into the show notes all the links directly to your video. And this conversation was never intended to be a substitute for watching the video. You have to go and watch the video.
Please do watch the video.
And
Yeah, yeah.
and
We've only skipped most of it.
and I suppose just with an open mind. But I suppose to bring this and then obviously connect with Joe, and then I suppose to bring this to a sort of an optimistic conclusion, Joe, because you are optimistic, as I am
Yeah,
optimistic.
very, very optimistic.
Yeah. Like, I think um, the the malaise, the hopelessness is disempowering. There is a bright future that awaits us. We just need to kind of get there. So I think, Joe, if you can give us kind of bring us to a conclusion with your optimistic thoughts about the future.
Well, I think people feel that something's wrong. We
Hmm.
all we all know something's wrong. We can't put our finger on it. But when you feel like you're building your life on shaky foundations, it has a whole slew of negative consequences for you in the way that you feel, the way that you think, the way that you plan, because you don't feel like you're in control. Like everything's corroding around us, and you're working ever harder just to stand still. But once you see the problem, you can't unsee it anymore. Once you see the problem, your thinking goes from not understanding what's happening to understanding what's happening, and then being able to make a decision about how you protect yourself and your family into the future.
Hmm.
You reclaim that ownership of your own future. You take back control of your life because you know why you're doing it. And because once you see it, you can't see it, everyone else is going to see it eventually. Eventually, everyone's going to be on the same page here.
Hmm.
And this was makes me so optimistic is this is inevitably going to fail because more people are going to opt out. You
Hmm.
should not be able to print for free what I have to work for.
Hmm.
So I'm not going to work for what you can print for free. That's it, right? And the answer is Bitcoin. The answer is Bitcoin.
Hmm.
It's the perfection of money. It's neutral, independent, decentralized money for the world. It's rules without rulers. Nobody has an advantage.
Hmm.
It's secured by energy. It's the most secure network in the world. Nobody can stop you sending and receiving. It moves at the speed of light. You can carry it in your head. It's open to everybody. It doesn't have a politics. It doesn't care what you think. It's open to everybody. The code is open to everybody. It's perfect money, and it's going to separate money and state. And there's nothing governments can do about it.
Hmm.
In
Great.
fact, the logical thing is for governments to embrace it. And now you're starting to see that. It's the only way it's the only way out of insolvency for the governments is to embrace Bitcoin. Now that's that there's a big question marks in people's mind on why is that the case? But that's a whole other conversation. I would encourage you to start learning about Bitcoin by first watch the video,
Mhm.
which only mentions Bitcoin after half an hour.
Mhm.
But then there's some follow-on resources after the video. But everybody, it's like people should think about Bitcoin like the internet in the 90s. Sitting here in 2025,
Mhm.
you look back and think, well, surely the internet was obvious in the 90s, like the impact it was going to have on the world. It absolutely wasn't. And
Mhm.
it was really hard to get up and running. You need like a computer science degree to get online, pretty much.
Didn't Bill Gates famously say it was never going to catch on?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure it was Bill. I'm not sure it was Bill Gates. I think it was probably perhaps one of the others because he went headlong into it.
Yeah, yeah.
But, but the barrier of entry to be competent on the internet and access it, etc., in the 90s is way different from now.
Mhm.
Way different from now. And the penetration across the world was incredibly low.
Mhm.
It's like Bitcoin. In 30 years' time, we'll be sat here with grandkids, hopefully, right? And it'd be like, well, surely it was really obvious in the 2020s that, Bitcoin was gonna revolutionize the world.
Mhm.
I'd be like, well, no, we did our best to try and wake people up, but it's a technological adoption cycle. But Bitcoin is that civilizational level change technology, like gunpowder, like
Mhm.
the internet. Like there's no neutral strategy here. If you ignore it, you lose. If you embrace it, you win. And so eventually everyone embraces it because it's just game theory. You embrace it, you get a competitive advantage, you succeed, you do well, your wealth grows over time, you build more businesses, you create more innovation, you help make it more accessible for other people. And then
Mhm.
we separate money and state.
Mhm.
That's it. Like the end is known. It's just the speed and the path of which it takes from here to there. And that's what gives me just massive optimism for the future. Is I can see where it's going. And
And so I think as a listener's next step, I think it's click the link below, watch Joe's video, just with an open mind and form naturally your own conclusions. Now, look, when
yeah,
I think there's lots of links to you, Joe, and so people are going to discover pretty quickly that you had a decade in finance, you worked at Goldman Sachs, and then you've had a decade as an entrepreneur. But I think there's a slightly there's just one sentence on a part of the puzzle which I think people will find really fascinating, which is it, that all started with you in a pea factory in Hull, you know, and then you went on to study physics, and then just in a sentence, because I just think it's absolutely astonishing your pathway from physics, studying physics, not really knowing what to do next, through to I suppose where we are today was like a particular module during your physics degree. Tell us a little, just in a sentence.
yeah, well, yeah. I mean, I'm from Yorkshire, but I was studying physics at Oxford. In my second year, didn't really know what I wanted to do, but there was an optional module called financial physics,
Mhm.
um, which I decided to take, which was the derivation of option theory
Mhm.
of the Black-Scholes equation, which underpins option theory, which they won a Nobel Prize for, from first principles in physics. It's roots in Brownian motion, in the way molecules would move around.
Mhm.
And so physics underpins option theory, and I thought this is amazing. I'm so excited about this. I spent the summer working in a pea factory in Hull, half an hour stacking boxes onto a conveyor belt, and the other half an hour with my option book in the corner, trying to learn everything I could about options. And then I
Mhm.
decided that's what I wanted to do, and applied to Goldman Sachs, and was lucky enough to get in, and then you know careers all sort of evolved from there. Um, but you know I don't want anyone to trust what I'm saying on
Yeah.
any of this stuff. Big people who have found Bitcoin, who consider themselves Bitcoiners, just say, don't trust, verify. Don't trust what I'm saying whatsoever.
Mhm.
Go away and engage in critical thinking.
Mhm.
Think about these things from first principles by watching the video and then watching other videos, and you know, come to a conclusion yourself. You may disagree. I
Mhm.
don't think you will. You may disagree. But then when you employ your critical thinking and you think about, okay, well, now I understand the problem. What's the solution? You can think about property,
Mhm.
store of value. You can think about gold, think about all these stock market. Don't own any of those things.
Mhm.
The only thing you can own is Bitcoin. It's
Mhm.
the only thing you can own. No one can take it away from you. No one can stop you sending it. It's the only thing you can be actually self-sovereign with. And it's perfect money. It's going to eat the world.
Mhm.
And when you go down that chain of thinking, I would bet my boots is that that's where you end up, because there's nothing beyond Bitcoin.
Okay.
And I would encourage people to start down that journey because it's incredibly empowering. You will feel like you regain control of your life and your future, and it will just change the way that you think about the world, and it'll change you as an individual in the way that you think. All for the better, in my perspective, but other people may disagree.
Very good. So the next step, have a look in the show notes, click on Joe's video, watch it with an open mind, reach your own conclusions. Joe, it was, as I said to you, at the beginning, seeing you speak at the conference was really eye-opening, particularly, you've only just like scrape the surface, particularly the way you've interconnected all of these themes. Whether people reach a different conclusion or not, that's for them. Let's at least, I think, try with an open mind to agree on the problem, which is what you've tried to do in the video. So look, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Well, it's been a pleasure to be here, so thank you very much, Paul.
Thanks, Joe.